Welcome. You have just tuned into Elevated Resonance with Daniel. Celebrate a life worth living. Hi, I'm Daniel Rutschmann.
And this is Dr. Pat.
Together, we will explore some aspects of the scientific foundation of what it means to be a conscious creator and get inspired to take action on creating a life worth living. I bring a unique blend of expertise to my work, leveraging an in-depth knowledge of concepts in neuroscience and the science of resilience, as well as over 20 years of experience in the corporate world and of what makes organizations successful. Know that it is possible for you to create a life, a team, or an organization that you truly want, despite the circumstances in your outer world. Are you ready to embrace change and celebrate a life worth living? Then this show is for you. Elevated Resonance with Daniel starts now.
Everyone, I'm Dr. Pat, and I'm here with most amazing Daniel. And here's what I want to say before we get started, Daniel. One of the things I just want to keep pointing out to people, that the best way to find out about how to work with Daniel, how to work with his company, the best way to find out how to talk to your boss about the help that your organization needs. And listen, you know I'm talking to you. You know exactly what I'm talking about, is to really have a call with Daniel or his team. ElevatedResonance.com. Today, you're going to hear why. I grew up in an environment, Daniel, where, like even on the interview, like when you went for the interview for the job or the promotion, it was very clear, leave your emotions at the door. However, that does not work in the world today. It doesn't work for Generation X, Y, Z, and millennials. It doesn't work. It definitely doesn't work for the X, Y, and Z generations, as we like to put labels on everybody. But we don't know enough about the emotional system and process, about what you talk about so brilliantly, to even understand what that means. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic that is very dear to my heart. And thanks for having me, Dr. Pat. You know, when I started my professional career in the corporate world, it was the same thing. You leave your emotions at the door. And I grew up in Germany, and there it's probably a little bit more emphasized, potentially. But I think times have changed. Organizations started to realize that things like emotional intelligence are super critical to the bottom line and the success of a company. But most companies or most people don't really know the details of what that means and how to work with it in a corporate environment or even in social settings sometimes, right? It's emotions are there. We can't deny it. Everybody feels them. But what to do with it, and what are they really? And how do they affect us and others around us?
But here we are today. If we knew what you're about to tell us today, there is something we can do. And I think that's always been the missing link. You know, it's great to really stand up in front of a meeting. And yeah, this is a true story. Stand up in front of a meeting, your boss is pounding on the table and he's saying, there's no room for emotions here. Right? Can you see this picture? Right? Pounding on the table, no room for emotions here. And you're like, oh my gosh, like what was just that? Mm-hmm. But today's show, we're going to really, what I like to do is we're going to lift the veil on this. You know, there are physiologically effects of emotions. Tell us what they are, because 9 times out of 10, look, I watch the Olympics. I've also worked with Special Olympics. I've dedicated and volunteered. So right now I'm watching the Paralympics. I watch them every night when I go home. I try to record them, support these amazing people. Mm-hmm. And even to this day, I am so touched, so moved, right? Because somewhere in my life, I allowed emotions to have place. But what about the other people that don't know the physiological effects, the psychological effects, what goes on in the body. Because I'll tell you, when I'm watching these people, I'm just shaking and I'm crying.
Yeah, those are, emotions are really the end product of an experience. If you think about it, you experience something and it triggers, it brings up an emotion, right? We're watching the Olympics. We get really moved by the performance, and everybody's different. And so, scientifically speaking, in the simplest terms, an emotion is a chemical reaction in the body that gets triggered by the brain. Now, you might be watching something, I watch something, you have a very different emotional reaction to it. Why? Because the brain is perceiving information through the senses and is processing it, it's translating it into chemistry. And that means, depending on how your brain is wired, your reaction might be very different than mine. So let's take an example. Someone says something to us, right? And so the process, we hear it through our ears, the brain starts to process it and triggers certain thoughts. And each of those thoughts turns on a neurological network in the brain. And the more thoughts you have that come up, the more neurological networks get turned on. And once you have enough of those alive and turned on, then they work in a combination, in a certain pattern. They start firing. Now, those thoughts, if we accept, believe, and surrender to those thoughts, and the networks start to fire up, and often that happens subconsciously, right? We hear something and something happens in the back of our head and we start to react. But what happens before that is we accept, believe, and surrender to those thoughts that come up, triggered by an experience. Someone is saying something, for example, and then the brain, what happens in the brain is that neurotransmitters begin to influence neuropeptides. And neuropeptides are, we could call them the chemical messengers of the brain. And the neuropeptides start to send signals down the spinal cord to different hormonal centers, depending on what they are tasked to do. So if someone says something that sets you off, there is a good chance that those neuropeptides going to signal your adrenal glands. And then that hormonal center releases very strong chemicals that we are very familiar with that make us feel a certain way. In this example, would be angry or resentful. But it doesn't stop there. Then the brain checks in with the body and says, oh, you feel angry. That means I need to create more thoughts equal to that emotion. And this is where this feedback loop starts. And if we don't intercept at that point, it starts to spiral. This is where we get cut off by a car on traffic, and we are late. And at the end of that thought process, we are so angry and blaming our partner for being late and being cut off. And I'm going to go into the office and I'm going to tell my boss really what I think about him. And it just goes on and on and on. And so when an experience triggers a negative emotion, it triggers the stress response, the fight or flight or sympathetic nervous system. We talked about that, I think, in the 4th episode, where we talked about living in stress and living in flow. And over time, we get wired to that emotion and we get addicted because it's a strong chemical. We get literally addicted like an external substance. That's how that works. That's what emotions really are: chemical reaction and the end product of an experience.
Yeah. You know what's so seductive about it? Let's talk about this. There are substances, alcohol, whatever you want to call them, that we know we're taking, and we know we're taking them, and we're consciously aware of it. And we know something is going to change in us by taking them. What you and I are talking about, what do you think? I mean, half the time in my life when things like this have happened, I was not acutely aware, right? I didn't take a substance, but yet I did. Right? I mean, this emotional addiction we have, and it's more insidious. It's harder to pinpoint until a friend walks up and says, what the bleep is going on with you? And you still can't figure it out. Isn't this why we have to really get some tools around this?
Yeah, I think one of the greatest things we can do is learn how to regulate our emotional states. Emotions are super important. They keep us alive. They make us feel alive. But it's important to know how to work with them so they don't run us, that we work with them in a way that it benefits us and not let them overrun or overrule anything we want to do. Because, one emotional reaction can ruin your whole day. Do you have a great day and then you get a text from a friend that is upset and your whole day is gone? It's that simple text message, and it's not even the text message, it's our response to it, our reaction internally that sets off this long list of chemical reactions in the body that then dictates basically, and we become the victim to our own programming.
Mm. And let's just also say this. Can you explain a little bit more about that? And also, why they last longer? Because, as I'm thinking about this, it isn't until somebody else points out an observation of how something is affecting me, right? But we have to be able to pinpoint these in ourselves. So can you talk a little bit about how do we detect the chemical reactions? What are some of the things that show up? And then there are some that are going to last longer than others. But if we can't pinpoint, I don't want to talk about all women, but I will say, Linda and I were joking the other day about the fact that, how we know when we're just right on the tip of something, we get a hot flash. Okay, just saying, I'm not categorizing that for women, but that's an indication for me when when my neck starts to get red, right? Or right, there's something going on in there, and it's not 110 degrees in the house, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and for every person, it's different, right? How it represents or how it presents itself in the body, right? We are all wired differently. We process information differently. We have different physiological conditions or makeups that where certain emotional reactions impact us in different ways than others. But I think one important thing to know for the people who are listening to this or watching this is, I know often ask this when I work with people and explain them the science of emotions, where we talk about those things. Now, if you have an emotional reaction, there's a chemical reaction in the body happening. The length of time it takes for those chemicals to subside is what is called the refractory period, the emotional refractory period, right? And I often ask them, it's like, so how long do you think it takes for those chemicals to subside? So then people usually think about, when they have an emotional reaction, when someone really triggers them, and they're like, maybe 15 minutes, sometimes an hour. And then I tell them, well, the majority of those chemicals subside within 2 minutes, even less. I was like, 2 minutes? How is that possible? Right? It's like, I know people that react for days at end or even longer. And this is another aspect that is very important to look into. So let's take an example, similar to what we talked about before. A coworker or friend says something that triggers us, right? Brain translates it. There's an emotional association that is hardwired. We have an emotional reaction. Chemicals take up to 2 minutes to subside. But what happens? We go back to our desk and ponder about what's happening. The same emotion and chemical reaction is caused by that pondering, because the body doesn't know the difference if it's a real-time, real-life experience, or if it's an experience we are producing by thought alone. So by us thinking about it again, we're sitting at our desk and you're like, he said that to me. Maybe it was a 2-minute conversation we had. We're sitting there and brooding over this. And that feedback loop starts, right? And all of a sudden, the brain recalls all the memories you have of that person, of all the things the person has said to you in the past. And now you're starting to, all those networks start to fire up to produce this story and this perception about this person, right? Then we go home. On our way back home, we're driving home from work and we think about it again. We go to bed, we think about it again. And what that does is it creates a chemical continuity, which means we are triggering the same emotional reaction over and over again, because for the body, it's the same thing if the person was actually saying it to us or which is thinking about it in our head. And that rehashing of those past events is what starts to hardwire that experience and that memory in our brain. And that emotional association, that person said that, this is the emotional reaction I have, gets hardwired neurologically in our brain and chemically in our body. And this is how we extend those emotional reactions, right? And when we talk about emotional refractory period, we could say it as kind of three different types. It's like when emotional reaction lasts for maybe a few hours or days, we call it a mood, right? If someone has a bad mood for weeks and months and just falls in that, we call it a temperament. And if it goes on and on and on, like very traumatic experiences, and we can't overcome that emotion and interrupt that chemical continuity, if it goes on for years, it becomes our personality. It becomes a personality trait, and we become an angry person. That person is always angry. And it always goes back to some type of experience that set off that cycle. And we let that circle, that feedback loop continue and started to hardwire that into our brain and into our body, chemically and neurologically.
Let me ask you a question about that too, because we're talking about, let's just call it an initial event, but there are many, many things that may trigger that, even though it's not that thing. You know, I just gave you the example of my former boss pounding on the table. Now, what I didn't tell you was that, of course, that didn't faze me one bit based on where I grew up. But I had another member at the table that started to shake, just literally, because the whole pounding thing by a pretty big man standing at the head of the table, she's sitting next to him, you could see she was traumatized by this. Those are the kinds of things also that we have to look at too, if we don't really do something to understand what's going on with us emotionally.
Yeah, it is something to be very aware of, right? We walk into a situation and something sets us off, like something so little. And our friends tell us, like, why does this bother you? It's because there is an emotional association to this particular experience we're having right now. It could be someone pounding on the table, someone screaming something, right? Particularly people that have very traumatic experiences is so hardwired in their in their chemistry, their biochemistry and neurologically in the brain that it automatically sets it off. And the more it gets hardwired, the harder it is to get rid of. But the first thing is to become aware of it. Everything starts with awareness. We become aware of it. It doesn't run on autopilot. It's like, oh, what's going on here?
Yeah.
And then we start to counteract and take the reins back in our hands, where we decide what we want to do with that, how we want to react in a certain situation, right? And it doesn't have to be as strong of an event as a traumatic experience that's setting something off. It could be as simple as I walk into a room and I see maybe a female with a red dress on.
Yeah.
And immediately I was like, something's wrong with that person. But it's because I had a really bad experience once with someone wearing a red dress, and it's so hard. I don't even remember maybe, but it's so hardwired. So it's always good to pause and question, what are we going to do about the situation, and really learn how to discern in a certain situation.
You have to have that. You know, here's where we are in the workplace. And this is why I said to all of you out there, if you're listening to this show, you need to really go over to Daniel's website and schedule a consult with him, because there's so many things now. Once upon a time, you could avoid working in groups. Remember when it was really a challenge to be on a group or a team in the workplace? Now forget it. And that is what's happening. And it's so interesting because I worked for a boss once and I did a presentation to an executive team, and I had a pink shirt on. And I remember the whole thing was done. It was really good. And the only thing my boss had to say was, don't ever wear pink again. To this day, I have somebody that bought me a pink blazer. I'm telling you, I looked at it, Daniel. Yeah. Okay, it's a true confessions. I woke up this morning, right? And there it was in my closet. It's beautiful. And I didn't wear it. And I thought about this as I was getting ready for the show, and I thought, I've got to share this. Do you know how long ago that pink shirt experience was with Frank Haslak? Frank, you know how long ago that was? And to this day, I went to grab a beautiful pink blazer out of the closet to wear today. And I didn't. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
We're talking also a gap between the way things appear and the way things really are. Frank's not here. He's not going to tell me not to wear the pink blazer, but I knew enough to know that's what was going on, but only until I got in the car. Isn't that what we need to catch this quicker so that I don't have to look for all new clothes to wear and just grab that pink blazer.
I mean, yeah, one important aspect of this is that there's nothing wrong with us having an emotional reaction. I want to make that very clear.
Thank you.
There's nothing wrong with having an emotional reaction. This is how the body and the brain are wired. The question is, how long are we going to react? What am I going to do about it? Do I want to have my whole life being triggered by a certain incident or not? And that is up to us. It's our choice. You know, there's obviously positive reactions, positive emotions, like things that make us happy. You know, that of course we don't want to change that. But there's other things that might prevent us from being a better collaborator or communicator, or being able to work more effectively with the people. And that is something we can work on. There is always an opportunity for us to grow and evolve from those experiences. And what you mentioned about the gap in our perception, this is, I mean, everybody's experienced that, right? Something is triggering you. You have a strong emotional reaction in the moment. You're in the refractory period of those emotional chemicals. It's never, ever a good idea to react or respond, to say something, to write something in that moment. You will always regret that email you sent. Always regret that text you sent right in that moment. I remember my parents, they always told me, like, sleep over it. Before you make that decision, before you act on it, sleep over it. Why? They didn't know the science behind that, but they knew you got to let the storm calm down. Let those chemicals subside. Let your perception normalize again, because it's narrow, very narrow on that threat right now happening in the moment. So we can't really think clearly. Give yourself a little moment. And there's beautiful techniques and practices that we teach in the work we do with organizations and individuals, where we help them. Like, we give them very practical tools of how to do that, how to interrupt that chemical continuity.
What is the best way to find out? I was talking to, I play table tennis with the folks at Boeing up here. So I'm always having a conversation with them. And I said to them the other day, I was talking to one highly level manager. And I said, you know what, you need to go check out Daniel's work. And I gave him your website. And he looked at me and he said, do you think I really need it? I said, do you think talking about a work situation with me and crying throughout that experience, do you think you need help with that? How do people do that? How can they schedule time with you? Please tell them.
Yeah, I mean, easiest ways, go to the website you mentioned, elevatedresonance.com, go to the contact page, and then just fill out the form. And then my team will look at it, and then I will reach out.
Yeah. And I really want to say,
talking to people. Yeah.
Yeah. This is not just for teams. This is like you're an individual, you're in the workplace, you've got lofty goals, you want to get there, but there's something in your way. You see, this is what we're talking about. Yeah, of course, maybe your team could use, but this is you too. This is you just don't understand why you're stuck. Look, I also sent a friend of mine who's a salesperson your way. Do you know why? This is a salesperson, top sales company, is afraid to quote money, the price. And I've been practicing with him. And what I realized is you need somebody else. You need Daniel, because there's a part of that has nothing to do with his knowledge, his skill, but his emotional reaction when he quoted a price that was really a great price for what he was talking about. I mean, the guy spent 10 seconds with the price and 3 minutes explaining the price.
Mhm. Yeah.
Isn't this what this is why you're doing the show? This is the work you do. This is how you can help people, isn't it?
Yeah. It is really about changing our inner state, our perceptions of things, right? And with money, that's always a tricky topic. And there's a lot of perceptions and emotional reactions that go along with it. And
Mm.
it's caused by the decades or years of experiences we have gathered and stored in our brain about our association with money. And so we have a relationship with everything, and everything we have a relationship with objects, with people, everything has a neurological network in the brain, and there's an emotional association with it. So if we wanna evolve or grow or become it, for example, if someone has trouble talking about money, right? Or putting it the right or asking for the right amount of money, that's something you can work on. You can evolve your perspective on that. And it has a lot to do with reflecting on what is your value, like how valuable are you,
Yeah.
and really forming a new narrative around that, and start to embody that and emotionally embrace that, and that starts to rewire our association in the brain with how we look at money or what it is and what it does.
Well, look, let's please walk people through what they can do about it. Talk about, the process/steps of stopping, breathing. Just walk us through and summarize what we talked about today.
Yeah, there's a lot of great tools that have been heavily researched. I mean, everything we do at Elevated Resonance is based on solid science that has been researched. So there's simple breathing techniques. There's breathing techniques that incorporate bringing up an emotion, a positive or renewing emotion. Another tool which is great, which comes from a great body of work. It's called SBNRR. That stands for Stop, Breathe, Notice, Reflect, and Respond. The first thing is always you need to become aware of it and then stop. Just pause. Just take a pause. Even if it's just for a few seconds, just pause. Don't let the autopilot run. Take a deep breath that starts to calm down the nervous system and your mind a little bit. At least it starts that process. And then broaden your perspective. Like, look, what are you noticing? What's coming up? What are you thinking about? What are you feeling? Become the observer of what's going on. And then you start to reflect on it. It's like, okay, why am I reacting this way? Or why is this coming up? And what do I want to do with that? Where might it come from? Just to give yourself a pause to start to explore different perspectives without any judgment. And you look at all those different angles, and that gives you a much broader perspective than the initial, immediate emotional response. And then you can choose to respond or not to respond.
Yeah.
But that process, if you do this consciously, it really starts to diffuse some of that energy that comes from this automatic reaction, and allows you to take a break to kind of potentially respond in a different way or not respond at all in that moment.
If we don't do this, then we end up having to undo, redo, and literally spend a lifetime of amends. Daniel, thank you so much for today. I can't wait till our next topic. I hope my buddy does call you. I really do. Thank you so much for everything, Daniel.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Pat.
Let's take a short break. And as I said before, when you're working with Daniel, it could be about you, your team. It could be about your family. It could be about your relationship. There are just no boundaries in the work that Daniel is doing, but there are a lot of solutions that are customized for you. Please don't stay in the misery of stuckness and emotional chaos. Let's take a short break.
You have been listening to Elevated Resonance with Daniel. Celebrate a life worth living. I'm Daniel, and along with Dr. Pat, you have been learning some of the key aspects of how to navigate towards your vision of the future by creating and living your best self every day. Tune in every first Thursday at 11 a.m. Pacific Time or 2 p.m. Eastern Time to become better in coping with the demands and challenges of everyday life. For more information about this show and how I can support you, visit my website, elevatedresonance.com.